start off with a piece here where we want to advance the understanding of intellectual property. I'm Don Budinger. I'm the chairman of the Rodel Foundation. Let me start with Mark Anderson, who we all know and love, but for this piece, he wears the hat as the founding chairman of INVNT IP, which is a consortium for the protection of IP. To Mark's left is Paul Ricci, who's chairman and CEO of Nuance Communications, the world's leading provider of speech solutions. And to his left is Steve Sprague, who's CEO of Wave Systems and a leading provider of software for hardware-based security. Mark, last year, I think you rang the wake-up bell for all of us. We have spent a lot of time in most of our businesses protecting our own IP quite rigorously and in most cases successfully. I don't think we thought of it as a national asset or a technological treasure for the fidelity of the technology in the world. Give us your view of this, and where are we versus a year ago? Better off, worse off, more aware, less aware?
So thank you, Don. For folks who are readers of SNS, they will already know something that we'll just touch on and go forward. We kind of backed into this whole story by looking at how the world economy works. And essentially, we're forced into the understanding that whereas it used to be driven entirely by maybe oil or coal or even money, now in the information age, guess what? It's driven by a new asset called intellectual property. And there are a lot of people who have figured this out to an nth detail, and who are, as companies and as countries, working to maximize that. And then there are, ironically, a lot of people who are the inventing folks who take it for granted that inventing is good and that IP will make them money, and who have to kind of come up to speed, I think, with what we're talking about now. So since the time that you and I talked last year, we have a lot more conversation and I think more public awareness about this issue. Business Week has run 2 cover stories on the question. We've got Richard Clark about a month ago coming out and saying that he thought that every American corporation had already been freed of its intellectual property by cyber attack, crown jewel IP. And Britain already has come to this conclusion. So there is a public conversation on the part of agencies and less so companies, I think. So the guys on the defense side and the agency side, even the trade side, seem to be getting it. The White House has spoken about this in trade deals in the Pacific. So it's encouraging in the sense of the conversation. But if you check the actual behavior, the number of attacks continues to rise, and the commercial importance of this issue as a drain on inventors gets worse.
Wow. Paul, you've made some acquisitions lately. How important is the intellectual property and the assets you're acquiring to your decision to acquire?
Well, first, I just wanted to make a comment and applaud Mark for his leadership on what I think is a really important issue here, and an issue that doesn't fit easily into the technology industry, where entrepreneurialism is so celebrated, and we tend not to look with much favorability on extraordinary measures and state intervention. But this is an excellent example of a problem that won't be solved simply by companies individually, and it's going to require concerted action by each corporation itself, action by a consortium of groups of companies, and cooperation with the government. And I would agree with Mark that the situation is better than it was a year ago, but I don't think the situation is better at the rate it needs to be to counteract the serious problems that are at hand. Specifically to your question, we've made maybe 50 acquisitions over the last decade, and technology and intellectual property have been the predominant motivation behind the vast number of those acquisitions. We invested through acquisitions and internal investment probably around $3 billion in the last decade in intellectual property, and it's the centerpiece of our company's value, and it's extremely important to us to have rules that let us manage that internationally. Among other issues, we are a supplier to large global brands, automotive companies, cell phone manufacturers, consumer electronics companies, that require from us intellectual property protection on a global basis when they're using our technology. And the growing threats to that through various state actions around the globe represents a real issue for us. And so this is a paramount concern for us.
Steve, what kind of grade do you give us? Are we doing well at this in your view, as satisfactorily as needed, or are we behind the curve?
Oh, I think the reality is we're clearly behind the curve. I mean, every metric's going the wrong direction. So if you look at the last $1 trillion of IT spend on security, can we name any metric where we think we're really comfortably improving? You know, theft of information is up, loss of intellectual property is up. We only track the most mundane content, which is your personal identifiable information. A corporation doesn't have to report if it loses all its core secrets. So the fundamental theft of IP is generally well underreported. So I think it's a real challenge that exists in the marketplace today. I think that we are applying much older technologies to a modern problem, and our rate of change is very poor today. I think there are interesting initiatives that are out there, but this, I agree with you, this requires much more than any one company's action. It requires a concerted, sustained effort. And I think, you know, for good or for bad, I think government's in a clear leadership position on this. If we stopped talking about IT security and we started talking about health and safety, we'd be better at this. It's a health and safety issue. We've gone out and, you know, people keep dying by getting hit in the head with bricks, and nobody wants to buy hard hats. It is that simple a conversation. Or we put seatbelts in every car and nobody's fastening them. You know, I mean, we just have to have a generation of kids who sit in the back and say, you know, you really have to click your seatbelt or we can't go. And it's taken, what, 30 years before we realized that clicking our seatbelts was actually a pretty good plan, and it's saved a lot of lives.
So, Mark, how do we advance the nation's consciousness with this? And do you sense in the political campaign, are you heard? Do you feel listened to?
It's very hard for us to tell if we're being listened to or not, except you see that the words come forward. So I think that's heartening. I expect that during the presidential campaign in the United States, we hope, and I think that we will see, either a debate-related conversation or something like that on this issue of inventing, of America as an inventing nation, and what inventing nations and companies need in terms of protection. So I believe it's becoming a front and center trade issue. And I know that Mitt Romney's talking strongly about this, and I think that Obama, in his TPP treaty work, has been talking strongly about this. The Commerce Department just stepped forward with their very first tariff action based on some dumping charges that were found to be true. So everybody's kind of playing the right game. And the State Department, same thing. Hillary Clinton's been talking about this. So I do feel like we're getting into the conversation.
Is the threat greater at the negotiating table with, say, taking your company to do business in China and listening to them tell you the way that's going to work? Or is it in the cyberspace of just outright theft?
You know, I think one of the reasons we're here is because there is not a strong academic foundation right now for understanding the proper valuation of intellectual property, piece by piece, or its role in the global economy. If you went to UChicago right now and said, give me your best economists and put them right here on deck with us and give us those numbers you just asked me for, they'd be clueless. And so we just don't have the information. And one of the things I think you're aware of, John, is we're trying to create not just the lobbying power to get this fixed, but the academic foundation for understanding as a group, what does it mean if the value of intellectual property is higher than we thought it was? What if it's not the replacement value, as we've all been saying in our books? What if it's really the international competitive strategic value of that crown jewel thing that was just created by Nuance? What is that value to someone who wants it, who may not want to invest themselves? And that value is inevitably going to be higher, I think, than what it looks like on the books of any corporation.
I think, though, there's a much bigger problem. I think the problem is it starts with education. We're training the children the wrong way today. So how many people's kids are on social media today? I mean, everybody. And so what's their perspective of sharing information? We type it all in. So clearly the new model for development inside Nuance is going to be we're going to set up a cloud service and everybody's going to chat. Well, that's not going to work because all the content that we create is instantaneously shared with all. And so today we're actually, the fundamental educational model is not towards a mechanism of control, but a mechanism of just complete blast it out there.
Well, you know, this fits the whole open source movement because there's a very legitimate movement in the world called open source, and it's got great heart in it, and Linus Torvald, there are a lot of reasons why there ought to be part of our technology universe, which is open source, and no doubt there will be. But I think that's exactly where you're headed, because our kids believe in this, a lot of them,
right,
but they haven't had the discipline of having to raise money, honor shareholder value, run a company, run a country, and do these things which require not sequestering, but protecting the investments that were made by a limited number of people. And once they have that discipline, they'll understand, I think, that there are two types of things here. There are what we're calling the crown jewel IP held by a country or a company. And there are things that everybody wants to share. I'm sure Nuance, I mean, we all will share things. It's to the benefit of everybody to have shared APIs and shared technology to the degree that it doesn't disadvantage those who made the investment.
I just want to emphasize this point that Mark made, that part of the problem is our inability to deal with, we can understand the local momentary damage that's done to one particular act, but the accretion of this damage and the diminution of our global competitiveness, not just of companies but of whole industries, is not so obvious at any given moment in time, and I think that results in us underinvesting as an industry and as a country in the solutions to these problems.
Let me ask all three of you, just looking back on my own experience, I remember when we first went into Japan in the mid-1970s, we wanted to set up a joint venture. You'd go down to MIDI and you'd meet with the bureaucrats and they would tell you what the ground rules were. You need a Japanese partner, 5149, we want to see your IP. Those were sort of initial negotiating positions that you could get beyond if you knew how to, and you could keep your IP and you could keep the products that the joint venture made back out through the American or European source. I get the sense now, let's just say you're GE, and you want to go to the Chinese market and you want to make jet aircraft engines and sell them. I have a sense they've got a lot stronger hand to play in how they deal with our IP. How would a GE handle the current condition with an ambitious player like China that's got more power than what we've seen before?
It's funny that you mentioned Japan, because Japan, from the Chinese perspective, they must see us and the Japanese radically differently. The Japanese have made a career, since they understand this model, of not caving on this in China. And so they bring assembly plants to China, but they don't bring the chip manufacturer, chip design CTO to China, which we do all the time. So it must be kind of funny to them, because the Japanese have learned to say no, and they do very well, and they are the top investors in China, as you know, they get it. Whereas when Jeff Immelt shows up, they say, well, Jeff, if you want to bid on the 919 airframe, that you're going to have to give us the blueprints to the jet engine. And he just caves. So I think they must be laughing at us. But the trouble is that the amount of money that it took and all the years of R&D that it took to get to that one blueprint is probably worth $500 billion. It's worth a lot of money. It's not just the $500 million that are on the books. And that's gone.
So do you have something in your architecture of this idea that would provide a tool for a GE where they wouldn't cave?
Right. And I think the way to do this is carrot, not stick. And what we need to do, starting on the country side, is to make sure that countries, as they develop trade deals internationally, have as a top or a leading priority, do all the participants in this deal protect intellectual property? Not by word, but by deed. There are a lot of countries who have laws but don't enforce the laws. So if they provably do protect IP, great, get on board, let's do a free trade deal together. And this is what we're seeing, by the way, with the TPP trade deal that Obama's trying to drive in the Pacific. But if, on the other hand, if you're not willing to protect my intellectual property, why would I do a deal with you? Because I recognize that whatever the contract says, I'm going to lose much more out the back door. Why would I do that? And so I hope that that wisdom kind of moves into those people who are the actual players and designers of trade agreements. And that in this post-information age, they too recognize that by putting that carrot front and center, even those whose model today requires theft or forced disclosure of IP will have to modify that in order to continue exporting. And exporting is the prime driver of those models.
But I also think the theft is enormous today. I mean, the reality is that we're concentrating the data, we're putting it into cloud services. You compromise the access control to a single cloud service, you get all the data. And it's just systemic. I mean, the fact that RSA was able to lose the RSA token key and 40 million people's remote access fell off the table is just completely ridiculous. We know how to do it better than that. We need to do it better than that. And we need a much greater focus on intellectual property. How many people are using an iPhone? How many people used to use a BlackBerry? So you all understood that in the transition from going from a secure messaging mechanism to a completely insecure mechanism, you made that choice. And the problem is that now when somebody compromises your credentials, which happens every single day, they have persistent access to your intellectual property and you have no knowledge. And we know how to solve these things. I mean, you have huge initiatives that are underway based on standards, based on deployment. It is the aspect of putting seatbelts in the car. Security infrastructure needs to become built in. It needs to be part of the design. We need to stop stapling bumpers to the front of our cars we bought from Ford and expect a car that's been through crash testing, properly safety tested, and that has the manufacturer's liability standing behind it. And that mental image, when we talk, my favorite one here is EPA. EPA put out a rule that said no more lead in motherboards. Took 3 years. 3 years. Placed all the motherboards in the world, manufacturing process with lead-free solder. Brilliant plan. The information assurance crowd, we've been at it for a decade, and still the request to put stuff in the box or use stuff that's in the boxes falls on deaf ears. Why would we want to do that? I mean, we should shoot the IA community and put EPA in charge. It sounds like a crazy thing, but they actually know how to pass clean air legislation. And you can see almost all the way across LA today.
I agree with Steve that there are very practical things that can be done, but I do think there's a market failure issue here that's not so easily dealt with. And by that I mean, just to take the example, Mark has been very vocal about GE, and there's an example where in his scenario, there's an externality to the action of the loss of that intellectual property, and
right.
and there's no easy way to capture that externality to other companies and to an entire industry. And once again, we really need state action to help find a way to do that.
Like how give us an example of how that could work.
Well, Mark has mentioned a couple of the government treaties and negotiations are underway, but I think the government could be far more vocal on this. It has, as of late, been somewhat more vocal about warning people of cyber theft and other expropriations, but I don't think there's nearly enough being done on this. Nearly enough leadership being provided on this by the government. And I think there's some reluctance to do that, and it's not fully embraced by industry either, which has very conflicted views about this. Right. They're concerned about, and it's not just China, they're concerned about their loss of market opportunity and less interested in solving the long-term competitive issues that may be arising out of this.
Can Mark's idea give us the voice that we need?
Well, it's a step in that direction. I don't think this is a problem that's going to submit to a single solution, but it is certainly a step in that direction. And awareness of that is important. It's quite extraordinary that I wonder how broadly understood it is about the problems, for example, of the theft of IP from computers, from laptops that when you're traveling overseas. I don't think that's commonly understood. That's an extraordinary statement, really.
And Mark, you've got an announcement that's coming soon. Do you want to give us a sneak preview?
Well, so this is not an announcement, but we're glad to be here. And clearly you can tell where we're headed with this. We will have an announcement at some point, a few months from now. But we wanted to share this idea with our friends here at FiRe, and particularly to recruit your own interest and support. So as part of you'll see all week there are things that are happening that are not just talk, they're action. This is one of those. And if you as a company or as someone who's involved in an agency or whatever are interested in this subject, please get in touch with us. We certainly recruit your interest and support. What you're going to see is a growing number of countries, companies, and agencies, and I hope universities, all working together to solve this problem. Some people think it's insolvable, but I don't. But I know that the first step is exactly what Paul's saying. First step, we've got to get the word out. This has to become a dinner table conversation for a lot of people. And then once that's happened, we have to have some pretty good ideas about how to fix this problem.
I actually think the next step is just raw action. So you've got enormous industry standards. I mean, so everybody, just in context, to put some context to this, there are 500 million PCs that have been swapped out with hardware security on the motherboard. Nobody's turned it on yet. So turn it on. It's every medical system, it's every financial system, it's the infrastructure that's there. So who's going to step up first? Is it going to be a company that steps up first? Well, a few companies that have done it think it's absolutely brilliant, but do you need government to stand up and say, okay, let's put our resources on the table and let's demonstrate that when we turn it on, we make all the passwords go away, and that's a good thing. And so I actually think that you can have an enormous benefit of performance and efficiency, and I would ask everybody a very simple question. When you look at the cost of a carrier managing a device or Apple managing an iPad, the dollar transactions are in the tune of less than $100 per device per year. Because if it's more than that, Apple would be bankrupt. Yet in the PC world, we today spend $1,000 to manage a PC. So the savings are enormous. The return on investment is enormous. If we move to a model where we had only trusted devices connected, you can't hook a random radio to the Verizon network. It is a known device. That one model saved the cellular industry in the early 1990s. It saved the cable industry in the late 80s because you have known devices with very little fraud driven by the actual performance of the device. This is something we know how to do. There's clear technology and path. There's clear understanding that it's there. It's open, it's vendor neutral, it's worldwide. And yet the action on the ground, while everybody wants to talk about this, it's a fantastic case study of kind of the laissez-faire that is today around this concept. So when you lose all your shareholder value because your intellectual property went out the door and you discover the Chinese building exactly the same product you were building for half the amount, then don't be surprised because it's happening every single day. The networks are being pinged.
You're going to see, I think, Don, that each member of the INVNT IP group has his or her own strength. Stephen obviously is in security. He has great strength there. And our job isn't to be a single, pyramidal structure, but rather to enable all these players to do their best in what they think is best. So this is going to be a multi-layered, multi-pronged effort. It'll take that internationally to succeed.
We have time for a question or two. Anybody have one? Okay, then Mark, your last thoughts as we depart. What would you like us to walk away from FiRe understanding that we do not understand as we enter this morning?
Well, last year we brought forth the idea, which I think has been confirmed, that the global economy cannot sustain the level of theft or parasitism on inventors that's happening today. And so I think what we're trying to bring forward now is let's do something about this. We've created an actual group. We've got a name. We've got a bunch of first-grade, top-level players, both in terms of companies and in terms of countries. Those countries, by the way, include Australia. They include the EU, the UK, United States. And let's go. Let's do something positive. And anybody who wants to get on the train with us, we'd love to have you there.
I think you'll get a lot of volunteers. Steve, Paul, Mark, thank you.
Thank you.